Welcome to Season 2, Episode 12 of The Thursday Show. We are doing a series on Genesis. Last week, we discussed Cain's departure, and this week we will cover the descendants of Cain, starting with Lamech, and we will look at some of the descendants of Seth as well. From Genesis 4:19 to the end of the chapter. You may have noticed that today I am dressed like a banana. This is whimsical for a couple of reasons. First of all, I do not typically dress like a banana on the Thursday show. Also, I do not believe that humans and bananas share a common ancestor. This is one of the themes here on Season 2 of the Thursday show. Being as how we are going through Genesis, we are discussing creationism and creation. And contrary to several notions that are coming out of the materialistic evolutionist worldview, I do not believe in a continuity between man and banana. Why then would I dress like a banana on the Thursday show? Well, because next week is Purim. Purim is a holiday in which we celebrate the defeat of the wicked Haman. It is traditional to celebrate Purim by reading the book of Esther, and every time the name Haman comes, you boo, you hiss, you make noise with noisemakers to blot out his wicked name. Haman is a bad guy. He's the worst. Isn't it interesting how whenever someone tries to inflict Israel with a genocide, they often end up with a holiday in the end? God has made promises to the Jews which will still be fulfilled in the future. So any attempt to annihilate them is not going to be successful. There's also a tradition on Purim to wear costumes. Hence my attire, my banana raiment today. If we call it a banana costume, it has a bit of a different connotation from banana raiment. Costume sounds like I don't typically dress this way. Raiment is more, day-to-day attire. Raiment is more of a King James kind of term. But that's neither here nor there. Genesis chapter 4, verse 19. Now, in the context, last episode 11, you can go check that out. We looked at Cain's departure into Nod, and he built a city there. It seems that Cain's line continued in rebellion. We will get the scoop here on Lamech, who is the sixth from Cain, a seventh generation, if you count Adam. And Lamech is a proud polygamous murderer. He is a bad guy. His name means warrior or conqueror. Verse 19. Lamech took 2 wives. The name of one was Ada. The name of the other, Zillah. Now, the rabbis believed that one wife was for childbearing and one wife was for pleasure. I'm always a little cautious when it comes to rabbinic commentary, especially this far back into the past. But Rashi has some interesting thoughts on this that I thought I would share. Okay, Rashi's commentary on Genesis 4:19. Ada, he says, she was the wife intended for propagation, and she was so named because she was repulsive to him and kept aloof from him. Other versions read from his table, for Ada is the Aramaic word for surah, meaning kept aloof. That's a pretty sick burn there, Rashi. Okay, so his thought would be that Ada was repulsive to him. But Zillah, Rashi says, she was the one for companionship alone, and she was so named because she always abided in his shadow. The word tzil, from whence we get tzilla, means shadow. He cites that this is the statement of the Agadah in Genesis Rabbah 23:2. So you can read the Midrash there if you want something a little bit older than Rashi. All right, so this is interesting. Polygamy is a sin. By the way, that is a controversial topic right now. There are some attempts to redefine marriage in some ways that are very explicitly sinful. And so there are a lot of conversations going on amongst evangelical scholarship right now about what exactly is marriage. I think we can derive from the statements earlier in Genesis that the two shall become one flesh, that marriage, as God intended, is to be between one adult male human and one adult female human. These points are coming under attack. So if that is God's intention for marriage, and sin is that which goes outside of God's desire, why then did God seem to allow polygamy? Well, I would say that in the hardness of man's heart, sin is the normative experience today after the fall. So often God puts out things to deal with sin. We'll take, for example, divorce. Divorce is something that God does not like, but he does give some rather clear guidelines for how to do divorce because of sin. Since sin is in the world, we know that we're going to have marital problems. And so it's not that God wants us to have divorces, but he puts out the guidelines for them. When we look at the Mosaic Law, there are systems in place to prevent rape, which I think everyone would agree is a sin. But being as how God knew that there would be sinful people doing sinful things, he put within the Mosaic Law systems for dealing with rape and other sexual sins for that matter. So does that mean that God says that rape is okay because he's got guidelines or he's got laws written about what to do when there is rape? Of course not. In the case of polygamy, it is clearly a perversion of God's intention for marriage, which is a divine institution. Since sinful man is bent on breaking the system, since sinful man is living in the world which is bent against God, since the man is living in a sinful world that is being run by Satan, who is God's enemy, God knows that man is going to mess up on the monogamy front. So he has certain provisions in place for protecting the divine institution of marriage, even when sinful man comes in and perverts it with polygamy. What would be the alternative? God striking down man every time he falls into a sexual sin? If that was the case, then there would be hardly any humanity left to fill the earth. So, just because a wicked man like Lamech has a polygamous marriage doesn't mean that we are allowed to. By the way, it was not only wicked people like Lamech who had polygamous marriages. Abraham was polygamous, so was Moses, David, Solomon. Several women are the victims of or instigators of sexual sin throughout biblical history. Of course, in the Purim season, we remember Esther, Queen Esther, who was put into a a harem. The king was intending to have sex with a new woman every night until he found one that he liked. And he stopped with Queen Esther. So her story is one of rape as well. Ruth is a bit of a controversial one. I've gotten into some trouble for saying this, but I think if we look at what Ruth did with Boaz, it looks like she might have been taking advantage of him because he was drunk. Others would say, no, you're misreading it. Whatever the case, marriage is the union of two sinful people. And so, as a divine institution, it's something that God wants us to uphold, but God also recognizes what we are going to break it. And so a healthy marriage in these sinful bodies is going to be characterized by a lot of apologizing and forgiveness as we continue to transgress each other. And much of that would be reduced if we would simply stick to God's intention of monogamy. Okay, so Lamech, he's got two wives, Ada and Zillah. Now let's take a look at his sons. Ada gave birth to Jabal. He was the father of those who dwell in tents and have livestock. His brother's name was Jubal. He was the father of all those who play harp and flute. Zillah gave birth to Tubal-Cain, a forger of every tool of bronze and iron. The sister of Tubal-Cain was Naamah. Okay, now there's a lot in there, right? First of all, it's saying that Jubal was the father of all those who play the harp and the flute. Well, how can that be? Eventually, we get further down into the biblical narrative, and the entire world is all of humanity is wiped out except for Noah and his family, 8 people. How could it be then that in Moses' time we have a group of harp and flute players who have who would see Jubal as their father? How do we have tent dwellers and livestock keepers who see Jabal as their father? What does that mean? I would say that the father sense here, Moses is speaking of the father of innovation, if you will. So here we have a man from early on in the antediluvian world. That's a fancy word for pre-flood. Before the flood, people were inventing musical instruments and art and beauty. Others were forging with with bronze and iron. And we see the dwellers in tents with livestock. Okay, so these are very early innovations that were being thought up in the early generations after the fall. The innovations would have spread around the pre-flood world and eventually been preserved through the ark with those 8 people, and they would have carried the knowledge of technology from before into the world as we know it post-flood, and that's where it would have spread from there. It's interesting that we have Tubal-Cain, a forger of every tool of bronze and iron, here before the flood. There's a lot of misunderstanding, I think, about what the Bronze Age or ages and the Iron Age was, right? There's a school of thought out there. I think people sometimes oversimplify it, and they say, well, as man evolved out of non-humans, we started to chatter a little bit and then started developing language, and we also started using tools, using rocks, and then as we got smarter, we started using bronze, and as we got smarter, we started using iron. Actually, bronze and iron are a pre-flood technology that were available then. Whenever we talk about the Bronze Age, even the secularist will agree. Nobody is denying that iron was used during the Bronze Age. It just happens that iron became more available and accessible and workable during the Iron Age. That's when it became the main product rather than bronze. Okay, what does this have to do with anything? Well, when we get to Job chapter 19, and Job talks about writing with an iron stylus, I think that Job lived during what we would call the Bronze Age, yet he still had access to iron. Iron technology was around. It just wasn't as popular as it was much later in the Iron Age. Okay, so Jabal, Jubal, these are the fathers of those innovations. Of course, God intended man to work with livestock, but apparently Jabal, the father of those who dwell in tents and have livestock, figured out a way to industrialize livestock to integrate tents. So this sort of Bedouin lifestyle, which is still observable around the world today. Okay, so what is the scoop then on Tubal Cain's sister, Naamah? So the Midrash says that Abba Bar Kahana said, now that would be a rabbi who worked around 290 to 320 AD, so much later after the book of Genesis was written, after the destruction of the Second Temple, but still an old source. Anyhow, that rabbi said that Naamah was Noah's wife. Okay, now, was Naamah Noah's wife? It is possible. Both Naamah and Methuselah would have been 8th generation from Adam there. Methuselah was Noah's grandfather, and he was also the oldest one to ever live. So it's chronologically possible, especially considering the eclectic birthing ages. It is possible that Noah and Naamah were contemporaries. In fact, it's very likely that their lifetimes overlapped. But so it could work. However, I think it's a little bit unlikely. I would say that it is unlikely that Naamah was Noah's wife. There are not a lot of women who are mentioned by name in genealogies, but Naamah is one. If the biblical intention was that she was Noah's wife, I would anticipate that it would have been stated more explicitly in the Bible. Doesn't have to be, but that would kind of be the anticipation. The fact that she is mentioned by name does mean that there is probably some kind of significance to that. It's possible that somehow or another through the course of time, we have lost track of the significance of Naamah. Another possibility is that she is recorded here in order to give further attribution to the corruption and perversion of Lamech. The name Naamah means pleasant, graceful, or gorgeous. So it could be that she is listed here as a testimony to Lamech's perversion, the implication being that Lamech named her something like beauty and pleasure because he intended, when she was a baby, to take her for himself as another wife. Another possibility. Either way, we don't hear a whole lot more about Naamah from there. Okay, Genesis 4:23. Lamech said to his wives, Ada and Zillah, hear my voice, you wives of Lamech, and listen to my speech, for I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man who hurt me. If Cain will be avenged sevenfold, then truly Lamech 77-fold. Okay, that just escalated quickly. Notice the pride here. Now, when Cain killed Abel, he was remorseful, at least for the punishment that had been brought upon him. Right? We talked about that a couple episodes ago. You go to Genesis 4:13-14 there. Of course, at first he tries to deny it. I'm my brother's keeper. What is this? Then God says, well, this is the punishment. And he says, oh, this is too much for me to bear. No, not with Lamech. Lamech has a completely different tone. He's not remorseful, but he is boasting because he has killed a man. Now, the man only wounded Lamech, and Lamech responded with lethal force. He brags that it was a young man. Now, today, when a young man dies, we are very mournful because he died in his youth, and he was deprived of decades of life. Well, back then, it was even worse because back then, people could live for centuries, and to die as a young man then means you're being deprived of centuries of life. By the way, the man only hurt him. So Lamech, check this out. Lamech says that Cain will be avenged sevenfold. Where does he get that? He gets that from what God said. So Lamech is actually heeding what God said, but he is diminishing what God said and elevating himself. He's elevating himself above Cain by saying Cain only gets sevenfold. I'm going to get 77-fold. That's putting him above Cain. And what's more, apparently, since the man only wounded Cain, only hurt him, or only hurt Lamech, and Lamech said that he could kill him for hurting him, he is now putting himself above God. God says sevenfold. Lamech wants to put an even higher risk to hurting him than Cain. This Lamech guy, he is bad news. So Cain's line is pretty corrupt here, right? Starts with Cain and his murder. Then we see him going over to Nod, east of Eden. Looks like there's building up a city, perhaps with the intention of charging the tree. Within a few generations, we have Lamech, prideful, polygamous murderer. Okay, why does Moses give us this little bit? He could have just said, okay, Cain killed Abel, and then Cain went away, and then Moses could have said, then we started anew with Seth. He could have said that, but he did not. Why did God want him to include this terrible news about Cain's lineage? Well, I think that this contributes to the greater narrative of Genesis for a couple of reasons. First of all, it sort of gives us a taste of how the ungodly lineages and nations do. They drift further and further and further away from God. There has to be a conscious effort for man to return to God. And we'll see that in a bit through Seth's lineage. It also gives a foretaste of what we're going to see as the global situation here in a couple of generations. Right? Just as Cain departed from God and his lineage went absolutely broke, the mass of humanity is going to end up going in the same direction, even to a greater extreme. Okay, so Cain's line is broke. Fortunately, God has still made that promise. Remember back in Genesis 3 about a future serpent crusher coming. Satan perhaps tried to prevent this serpent crusher by having Cain kill Abel, through whom apparently Adam and Eve had the intentions of carrying on this lineage. But don't worry, God has promised that this serpent crusher will come, so God provides. Genesis 4:25. Adam had relations with his wife again, and she had another son and called his name Seth. For she said, God has granted me another offspring instead of Abel because Cain killed him. To Seth was also born a son, and he called his name Enosh. At that time, men began to call on the name of the Lord. So Adam and Eve intended for Seth to replace Abel, while Cain's line led to Lamech's rebellion. Seth's line led to people calling on the name of the Lord in the time of Enosh. This term, call on the name of the Lord, occurs, I think, 6 times throughout the Bible, and it typically has a very worshipful context. There is often something of a revival attached to the context of the phrase. The term revival is a bit of a tricky one. It's got certain Christian connotations, especially with certain denominations that might not be bad, but they might not be biblical either. The word revival is not in the Bible in most translations. It's sort of a post-biblical word that we've sort of developed to describe things. But that seems to be what's happening here, right? The world is becoming more and more corrupt. We see this especially with the lineage of Cain, but then in the time of Enosh, people turn to God. They start calling on the name of the Lord. Okay, this concludes Genesis chapter 4. And Genesis 5 begins the generations of Adam. Thank you so much for tuning in. I look forward to moving forward in the Genesis narrative with you in the future. And happy Purim, by the way.